Welcome again to the Bell Being Global Affairs Zoom Room, where we're here to continue on our series entitled The Middle East Objective Analysis. Now, last week we talked about the who of the Israel Palestine conflict. If you didn't see last week's video, I encourage you to see it because last week we started in 2022, and now we're going to go to the very beginning of the very first people who lived in what we currently call Israel and Palestine. Now, when a lot of people talk about Israel and Palestine today, and again, it's the end of 2023, there's a lot of talk about who owns the land. Whose house is it? Are people stealing people's houses? Are people stealing people's lands? Are people reclaiming their lands from before? Who's the owner of the land? Now, one thing that I found interesting, although a lot of people are talking about, property ownership and land ownership, I've heard of very few people who have bothered to even read or understand land law in either Israel or Palestine. Are you knowledgeable about what it takes to purchase a property in Gaza? Do you know how you can buy property in Jerusalem? Are you aware of the property rules and regulations and laws in Israel? See, these are things that we need to start familiarizing ourselves with because a lot of people have opinions on it, but they don't have the facts. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that land law, what it means to own and possess land, is different across the world. For example, I currently reside in the United States of America. And any American who's watching right now, when you think about owning property, acquiring property, getting a house, you're thinking about owning that forever. You're like, I'm gonna, buy this house. It'll be my house until I decide to sell it, rent it, until I die, and then I will it to my kids. When we think about, and when I say we, I mean Americans, when we think about property ownership, we think about the property is mine until I dispose of it, or the government or the bank takes it, or until something happens where the legal ownership is tendered. That's actually quite different from a lot of the world. So I'll use England because I studied law in England. Um, in England, if you're English and you're thinking about acquiring a property, you would never dream of this property being yours forever. As a matter of fact, when you go into contract to buy it, you buy it for a certain amount of time. I'm going to buy this house for a 20-year term, 40-year term, 900-year term. The concept of this property is always going to be mine would be quite foreign to you if you're English and if you live in a lot of the world outside of the United States. And that's because the way land is viewed across different countries, across different cultures, are different. And a lot of times when we think about Israel and Palestine and we think of it from an ownership, a lot of us think about how land is acquired and owned and shared and used in our own cultures. And we don't think about, well, what are the rules there? Now, if we don't have an international consensus in 2023 of what it means to own land, now imagine doing this exercise even in the same place, across 100, 200, 500, 1,000 years with different rulers and empires and leaders coming through. And each, ruler going to bring in their own laws and their own interpretation of what it means to own land. Because of that, it makes it very difficult to trace land ownership. And it adds a level of complexity when people are talking about Israel and Palestine and ownership and who has a right to be there. Because, one person may say, well, I was there and then I was kicked off my land. Now I want my land back. Well, what are the rules for that? When you said you were there, were you an owner? Were you a tenant? What was your relationship? What was your family's relationship to that land when you left? Before we get into those complexities, I want to just start simply, and we're going to look at not ownership. We want to look at this a little differently. Let's reframe the way we're looking at possession of land. And let's talk about who possessed the land, who lives there, who has a right to that property, who can say, who can come and who can go, if something can be built, if it can't be built. Possession is a better way to look at land in historical context than saying ownership, because there is no land deed that's 1,000 years old that's been passed down. That doesn't exist. So we're going to look at it from possession. So from a possession standpoint, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'll tell you now, no one's ever gotten this answer right. I've never met anyone who's answered this right before I told them the answer. But having said that, I'll ask you, maybe you'll be the first to get it correct. Who was the first people that possessed what we currently call Israel and Palestine? Who was the first people to possess the land? Now, a lot of you are going to answer and say it was the Israelis or the Canaanites. Those seem to be the top two answers that I get over and over again when I ask that question. Who was the first people to possess the land? Now, since I've already told you no one's ever gotten it right, and those are the top two answers, then you know that the answer is not the Canaanites and the answer is not the Israelis. So, for those of you who did not get that correct, I'm going to give you one more chance to answer the question or think about what's the answer to the question. Who was the first people to possess the land that's currently called Israel and Palestine? And I'm going to give you the answer before you have a chance to Google it. The answer is the Natufians. Now, the Natufians were around during a Paleolithic period, which is the Old Stone Age period. They occupied the land between 11,000 BC and 15,000 BC. Now, you're probably asking yourself, the Old Stone Age period, what was going on during that time? Well, that's when the woolly mammoth was still amongst us. That's when the Neanderthals were still around. That during that period is when people still lived in caves and had cave drawings. It's what we call the caveman. That's the period when Natufians lived in what we currently call Israel and Palestine. Now, they were hunter-gatherer people, and they are actually believed to have been the first sedentary hunter-gatherers in the world. Now, what's meant by sedentary is, although they were hunting and gathering and moving around, they built permanent structures that they routinely came back to as they were hunting and gathering. Now, the Natufians lived on this land for thousands of years, and eventually they became an agricultural society. Some of the Natufian settlements actually was used to build the very first, well, what's believed to be the very first city in the world, which is Jericho, a city that a lot of you will have heard about before. Now, the Natufians lived on that land, like I said, until the agricultural revolution started to happen across the world and in the Levant region as well. And different people started moving into the area that's currently known as Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine. And eventually, that more agricultural, sedentary lifestyle, all those people started to blend and integrate. And the Natufians eventually were no longer the dominant members of society. Another group did, and that group we'll talk about next week. So for this week, I just wanted to keep it simple and go over who was the very first people to possess the land that is currently Israel and Palestine. The Fenians were the first people to possess the land that's currently Israel, Palestine. They were there about 11,000 through 15,000 BC, and they just integrated with different cultures and groups of people that moved into the area as time went by. So next week, we're going to talk about the next group of people who became the dominant group of society after the Natufians. So thank you for watching this week. I'll see you next week. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you know whenever I have new videos. And visit my blog at bellbeingglobal.com so that you can get more details about the Natufians, who they were. I have a lot more information about them there on my blog, or you can subscribe to the premium videos where I'll go into more detail as well.